They called her just a nurse. That's what it said on her ID badge. Margaret Walsh, RN, 3 years tenure, pediatric ICU. They didn't know the faded Navy unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining told a different story. They didn't know that every morning before rounds, her trembling hand reached for that patch like a prayer she couldn't speak aloud. The fluorescent lights at Oak Creek Memorial hummed their mechanical hymn as Margaret moved through the pediatric ICU in Raleigh, her movements efficient and measured, the kind of precision that comes from a decade of muscle memory nobody asked about. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same bun she'd worn for 3 years. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft enough that new residents had to lean in to hear her. To anyone watching, Margaret Walsh was exactly what she appeared to be, a middle-aged nurse counting down to a pension, moving through her shift with the kind of competent invisibility that made her nearly invisible to administration. What they didn't see was the way her eyes tracked every monitor simultaneously, reading vital signs like a language she'd learned in places that didn't appear on resumes. What they didn't see was the way her hands moved with the terrifying precision of someone who'd learned to work in darkness, under fire, with shrapnel humming past her ears. The scars on her forearms, faint but there if you looked closely, caught the fluorescent light when she reached for supplies, thin white lines that would never quite fade, souvenirs from a school in Marjah that collapsed while she was pulling children free from the rubble. She touched the unit patch again as she arrived for the morning shift, her fingers pressing against the worn fabric through the jacket lining like a Braille prayer. Marjah was 18 years ago. 8 children pulled from burning concrete. 1 round through her left shoulder. 17 surgeries. And then she'd come home and never spoken about it to anyone except David, her ex-husband, and even then only fragments, because the nightmares had a way of making her voice louder than it should be, harder than it should be, like she was still shouting orders in a language he didn't speak. David had died 3 years after she'd walked away from uniform, never knowing exactly where she'd gone or what she'd seen. Daniel, her son, knew only that Mom had served somewhere overseas and didn't talk about it. That was enough. That was all anyone needed. The PQ at Oak Creek Memorial occupied the 3rd floor's north wing, 14 beds, each one capable of supporting systems for the kind of trauma that destroyed families. Margaret had worked this unit for 36 months without incident, without complaint, without drawing attention from anyone in administration. Her charting was meticulous. Her medication counts were flawless. Her patient notes read like documentation from someone who understood that precision in writing saved lives in court. Every entry was time-stamped to the minute. Every observation was specific enough that patterns emerged if someone looked carefully enough. Dr. Harrison Hargrove had been looking very carefully for 18 months now, and the patterns he was seeing made his jaw clench every time he reviewed Margaret's charts. Hargrove arrived for morning rounds at 6:24 a.m., his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile floor like a metronome counting down to something nobody wanted. He was 53, silver at the temples, the kind of handsome that came from money and confidence in equal measure. His watch cost $12,000. His suits came from a tailor in Charlotte who didn't advertise. He had 3 board members who played golf with him regularly at Tobacco Road Golf Club, and 2 of them had already approved the vendor contract with Medisupply Solutions that would net him $54,000 in kickbacks over the fiscal year, provided no one was looking too closely at the billing codes he was submitting. Margaret's meticulous charting had become a problem he could not afford. She had documented, with timestamps and specificity, that 3 patients this month had received diagnostic imaging procedures that her clinical assessment suggested were unnecessary. One 8-year-old with a simple arm fracture had undergone 2 full-body CT scans ordered by Hargrove despite normal X-ray findings, scans that generated $4,200 in imaging fees and allowed Hargrove to justify billing codes that didn't quite match the clinical presentation. Margaret hadn't flagged it directly. She'd simply documented what she observed, which was worse, because documentation created a paper trail that auditors could follow. She was becoming dangerous to him in the way that quiet people often became dangerous, through the accumulated weight of truth, recorded and time-stamped and utterly irrefutable. Hargrove had already begun building her termination file. 3 fabricated medication errors. 2 false patient complaints. 1 email to her previous supervisor asking vague questions about her reliability under pressure. The strategy was sound. By the time anyone thought to investigate his billing practices, Margaret Walsh would already be unemployable, her credibility shattered, her charting discredited as the work of someone unstable and incompetent. He was reviewing her notes on Jackson Vance's admission when the boy arrived at 7:15 a.m., brought in by ambulance with his father riding beside him, one hand gripping the stretcher rail while the other pressed against his son's shoulder as if physical contact alone could keep him tethered to the living world. The paramedic report was crisp and efficient: 8-year-old male, motor vehicle accident at 5:42 a.m. on I-40 eastbound, vehicle T-boned at approximately 45 miles per hour by a delivery truck whose driver had run a red light. The boy was conscious and responsive initially, but spinal trauma assessment revealed no movement below the waist. Paramedics had immobilized the spine, established for access, and transported Code 2 to Oak Creek's trauma bay. The CT scans were already done by the time Margaret arrived at the PQ. The radiologist's report was on Hargrove's tablet before she could even read the boy's admission paperwork: complete transection of the spinal cord at the T12 level with bilateral disruption of motor pathways. No significant hope for neurological recovery below the injury level. That was the language the radiologist had used. No significant hope. Commander Eric Vance looked like his photos, except the photographs hadn't captured the way his entire body seemed to vibrate with barely contained urgency, or the way his eyes tracked every monitor and every staff member with the intensity of someone accustomed to assessing threats. He was 46, lean and muscular in the way of men whose bodies were maintained as tools rather than vanities, and his SEAL insignia was visible on the gym bag he'd left at the foot of his son's bed. Margaret saw that insignia and felt something crack open inside her chest, a sound like concrete breaking, like metal screaming, like the particular frequency of a child crying underneath rubble. Jackson Vance was unconscious, sedated to prevent the reflexive movements that would cause his fractured spine to shift further. The ventilator was breathing for him at 14 cycles per minute, the rhythm steady and artificial, the hiss of compressed air filling the small space around his bed. His right arm was bandaged where the four had gone in. His left side bore a dark bruise that covered most of his rib cage where the seatbelt had held him at the moment of impact. He was 8 years old. 20 years ago, Margaret had pulled a child almost exactly this size from the rubble of a schoolhouse in Marjah while rounds were falling and dust was hanging in the air like a living thing. That child had been buried for 12 minutes. That child had not been breathing when Margaret reached her. That child was alive now only because Margaret had cleared her airway and performed rescue breathing on the rubble-covered ground while chaos erupted around them. She didn't know, standing in Jackson Vance's room at Oak Creek Memorial, whether that child had been a boy or a girl, whether the girl had grown up, whether she was alive somewhere in Afghanistan or whether the rescue had only delayed an inevitable ending. Marjah had broken something inside Margaret that she'd been trying to repair through 3 years of meticulous documentation and careful silence. Now the universe was asking her to do it again. Commander Vance looked up from his son's face and met Margaret's eyes for exactly 1 second before turning his attention back to Jackson. That was all it took. 1 second. One transmission of everything Margaret wasn't saying. Hargrove entered the room at 7:22 a.m., his tablet already projecting the radiologist's conclusions, his voice carrying the kind of professional certainty that made truth sound like prophecy. "Commander, I know this is difficult to hear, but the evidence is clear. Your son's spinal cord has been completely severed. There is no possibility of meaningful neurological recovery below the level of the injury. We can keep him comfortable, manage his care, but I think we need to discuss realistic expectations and what quality of life looks like under these circumstances." The words hung in the air like a sentence, like a verdict, like something final and absolute. Margaret felt her hands move before her brain could catch up, checking Jackson's full line, verifying the ventilator settings, confirming oxygen saturation on the monitor. The numbers were good. 98%. Heart rate 87. Blood pressure stable at 92/58. But what Hargrove was describing didn't require numbers. It required only acceptance of a story that a radiologist had told. She didn't speak. She simply continued her work with the kind of attention that made it clear she was listening to something Hargrove wasn't saying, watching something he wasn't seeing, waiting for something he wasn't expecting. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to unfold in the next 72 hours. Jackson Vance arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday afternoon, his small frame rigid on the stretcher, his 8-year-old eyes fixed on nothing at all. Commander Eric Vance walked beside his son with the controlled precision of a man whose world had just fractured, his SEAL Team 3 insignia visible on the gym bag slung across his chest. The car accident on Interstate 40 had lasted for seconds. The spinal cord injury would last forever, or so 10 consulting specialists were about to tell him. Margaret first saw Jackson in the pediatric ICU at 3:19 p.m. She was reviewing his imaging when she felt it, that familiar crack in her chest, the one she thought she'd sealed up 20 years ago in Marjah. The boy's face. The specific shape of his jaw. She'd pulled a child from rubble once, covered in dust and ash, screaming for his father. That child would be 23 now. This child was 8. The math didn't work. The face did. She didn't let her hands shake as she adjusted his monitors. By Wednesday morning, the 10 doctors convened in the conference room on the 3rd floor. Margaret stood outside the glass walls, pretending to review a chart, listening. Dr. Hargrove spoke first, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who'd already written the ending. Complete transection at T5. Imaging is conclusive. There is no neurological function below the injury level. The prognosis is permanent paraplegia. We're looking at lifetime wheelchair dependency, extensive rehabilitation, and realistic conversations with the family about quality of life. The other 9 specialists nodded. Neurosurgeon Chen. Orthopedic surgeon Rodriguez. Spinal specialists from Duke and Chapel Hill. Pediatric physiatrists. They had 60 combined years of expertise, and they had all reached the same conclusion: Jackson Vance would never walk again. Margaret returned to Jackson's room and found Commander Vance sitting beside his son's bed, holding the boy's hand. She noticed the slight tremble in the father's grip. She noticed the way Jackson's left leg twitched, just barely perceptible, when his father's thumb brushed across his palm. She noticed the inconsistency in his reflex responses. She noticed everything the 10 doctors had already decided didn't matter. She said nothing. At 2:15 p.m., Dr. Hargrove cornered her in Jackson's room while the Vance family was present. He'd been waiting for this moment, Margaret would later realize. A public stage. Witnesses. Permission to finally escalate beyond innuendo. Nurse Walsh, he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the tile walls, loud enough to make Commander Vance look up from his son's bed. Perhaps you'd like to explain to Commander Vance why you're questioning a treatment plan designed by 10 specialists. 10 doctors with a combined 6 decades of experience. Or does your associate degree somehow trump their collective judgment? The room went dead silent. Margaret felt Commander Vance's eyes on her. She felt Jackson's eyes on her. She felt the weight of Hargrove's smile, that predator's grin of a man who'd just trapped prey in a corner with nowhere to run. She took one measured breath. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not crack. "I've seen children survive worse than your doubts, Doctor," she said quietly. "Jackson will too." Hargrove's face darkened. A vein appeared at his temple, small and pulsing. "That is exactly the kind of insubordination I've been documenting, Nightingale. Undermining physician authority. Creating conflict with the medical team. Questioning orders from a staff physician." He turned to Commander Vance. "I apologize for this disruption. Nurse Walsh will be receiving a formal disciplinary notice." He left the room, and Margaret stood there with her hands folded at her waist, feeling the specific weight of humiliation that could only be delivered by someone with institutional power. Commander Vance didn't speak. He returned his attention to his son. Margaret adjusted Jackson's full line and continued her work as if her chest hadn't just been opened and examined in front of a Navy SEAL officer and his paralyzed child. The break room at 4:48 p.m. was where the isolation became official. Margaret sat at the corner table with her sandwich and her coffee, black, no sugar, the same way she'd taken it for 23 years, and opened the lid of her container. For exactly 8 seconds, she was alone. Then Sarah Chen, Marcus Rodriguez, Beth Morrison, and Jennifer Walsh, no relation, arrived in a cluster. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't speak. They simply grabbed their trays from the refrigerator with the synchronized precision of a coordinated maneuver, and they moved to the opposite side of the break room, settling at the far table like birds repositioning themselves away from a predator. Margaret continued eating her sandwich. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. But she felt the absence, the way the room had just rearranged itself, the way her colleagues had collectively decided that association with her carried a cost they weren't willing to pay. In the military, this was called being shut out. In civilian hospitals, it was called professional distance. By 5 p.m., it had a name. It was pinned to the public disciplinary board in the main hallway outside the administrative offices. The written warning was printed on official Oak Creek Memorial letterhead, using the kind of clinical language designed to sound objective while being devastating. Nurse M. Walsh documented insubordination, unauthorized questioning of physician orders, creating interpersonal conflict with medical staff, undermining clinical authority. Beneath that, in Hargrove's handwriting, first written warning. File for termination review pending state investigator consultation. Margaret stood reading it at 5:48 p.m. Doctors walked past. Nurses walked past. No one stopped. No one made eye contact. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the specific frequency that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, your own isolation in a crowded building. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She simply read the words, noted the date, and committed the language to memory. In her jacket pocket, beneath the synthetic fabric lining, her fingers found the faded unit patch she'd sewn there 20 years ago. Cloth so old it felt like skin. Embroidered text so worn the letters were barely visible. SEAL Team 3, Marjah Detachment, 2003 to 2004. She touched it once, the way a person touches a talisman. Then she returned to Jackson's room. At 6:15 p.m., in his office 2 floors up, Dr. Hargrove made a phone call. Margaret didn't know about it. He didn't know that Margaret was standing outside Jackson's room at that exact moment, watching the boy's monitors, noticing the slight laboring of his breathing during position changes, noticing the inconsistency that 10 doctors had collectively decided was impossible. "I need you to contact someone for me," Hargrove said into his phone. Margaret Walsh. Former Navy employee, unclear status. "I need to know about her reliability. Her psychiatric history. Any conduct issues. Anything that might explain her current instability." He paused. "Yes, I understand it's a privacy matter. Make it subtle. I have a disciplinary file building, and I need to demonstrate a pattern of questionable judgment." He hung up without saying goodbye, the mark of a man accustomed to power, accustomed to obedience, accustomed to the assumption that his requests would be treated as commands. Margaret didn't know. She was watching Jackson's oxygen saturation drop from 96 to 94 to 92%, watching his chest wall lag on his left side, watching the subtle signs that the 10 specialists had missed because they'd already decided the story had ended. She was reviewing his chart, comparing today's reflex responses to yesterday's, noting the inconsistency that shouldn't exist if his spinal cord was truly severed. Her hands moved across the keyboard with the precision of muscle memory. Each observation documented. Each detail recorded. Each inconsistency noted in clinical language that couldn't be questioned because it was rooted in objective fact. She didn't know that Hargrove had already begun the process of dismantling her credibility. She didn't know that 3 board members were receiving calls suggesting she was unstable. She didn't know that a state investigator was being fed false information about her conduct. She didn't know that her termination file was being constructed with the systematic precision of a surgical strike. What she did know was that Jackson Vance's breathing was becoming labored. What she did know was that his left leg had twitched 17 times in the last 4 hours. What she did know was that 10 doctors had gotten something wrong. And that knowledge, combined with 20 years of buried skill and 2 combat tours in a country that had taught her to trust her instincts over institutional consensus, was about to become dangerous. At 11:43 p.m., Margaret stood outside Jackson's room in the darkness of the night shift, her hand resting against the faded unit patch beneath her jacket lining. In the room behind her, a child was breathing wrong. Somewhere in the hospital, a doctor was building a case against her. Somewhere in the machinery of institutions designed to protect life, something had broken, and she was the only one who could see it. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitors beat their steady pulse. And Margaret Walsh, the quiet nurse who folded her hands and accepted insults without flinching, made a decision that would change everything. On Jackson's 6th day of declared irreversible paralysis, the conference room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled of stale coffee and the particular silence that follows a death sentence. 10 specialists sat around a polished table, neurosurgeons, orthopedists, rehabilitation physicians, each with credentials framed on offices across 3 states. They had reviewed the scans. They had consulted with colleagues. They had rendered their collective judgment with the finality of a gavel strike, permanent neurological damage, complete spinal cord transection at C5, wheelchair dependency for life, transfer to a long-term care facility in 72 hours. Commander Eric Vance listened without moving. His wife Sarah gripped his hand so hard her knuckles went white, then she collapsed into his shoulder, her body folding like something broken beyond repair. Dr. Hargrove stood at the head of the table, his tailored suit catching the fluorescent light, nodding with the gravity of a man delivering tragic news with appropriate solemnity, never mind that he'd been billing for 3 unnecessary procedures on Jackson's chart, charging Oak Creek Memorial for consultations that never happened, pocketing kickbacks from a medical supply company for equipment upgrades Jackson would never need. The boy upstairs didn't matter anymore. The paperwork mattered. The liability mattered. The problem that was Margaret Walsh mattered. At 11:13 p.m., while Margaret was working the night shift in Jackson's ICU wing, Dr. Hargrove sat in his office with the door locked and made for phone calls. The first was to Dr. Gerald Pierce, the board chairman, a man he'd met for golf every other Thursday at Wakestone Country Club for the past 5 years. "Gerald, I need to flag something about one of our nurses, Margaret Walsh. I'm concerned about her judgment. She's been questioning treatment protocols, contradicting my clinical assessments in front of patients." The voice on the other end of the line made reassuring sounds. The second call went to board member James Ashford, whom Hargrove had introduced to a real estate investment opportunity that had tripled his money. "James, there's a nurse causing some institutional friction. Margaret Walsh. Highly unstable, frankly. I worry about her fitness for this position." A promise to follow up. The third call to board member Robert Hayes, who still owed Hargrove a favor from the time he'd quietly buried a malpractice suit that would have ended Hayes' career, a single phone call to the right people, a discreet settlement, a file that suddenly didn't exist. "Robert, I'm documenting concerns about a particular nurse. Reliability issues. Prior psychiatric flags. I'd appreciate it if you and I could discuss her future here." A cold, practice silence followed by agreement. 3 board members. 1 network. The architecture of institutional power assembled in less than 10 minutes. Then he made the call that would cement his narrative. The number went to a Pentagon operator, transferred twice, connected to a grey-walled office in Arlington where Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh's former commanding officer, Admiral James Holloway, was reviewing deployment schedules for the next fiscal cycle. "Admiral, this is Dr. Hargrove, Chief of Medicine at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh. I'm following up on an employment verification for a Margaret Walsh. We're conducting a standard credentialing review and have some questions about her service record and overall psychological stability. I wondered if you had any insights into her tenure or any flags we should be aware of." Holloway's response was measured, official, the sound of a military man parsing a civilian inquiry through decades of protocol. "Dr. Hargrove, Margaret Walsh served with distinction. That's all I can appropriately discuss regarding personnel matters." But the call itself was the mechanism, an inquiry placed in an official record, a question mark attached to Margaret's file, a suggestion of concern that would bloom into suspicion the moment Hargrove's narrative took root elsewhere. The Admiral would think nothing of it. By tomorrow, the implication would be everything. At 2:13 a.m., While Margaret was changing Jackson's full line with the precision of someone who had performed the gesture 10,000 times, her pager buzzed. A message from hospital administration, report to human resources at 7:33 a.m. sharp. Investigation pending. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply looked at the pager, read the message twice, and clipped it back to her waistband. Jackson's monitors beat their steady rhythm, oxygen saturation 94%, heart rate 78, blood pressure 112/68, all the numbers that meant nothing because 10 doctors had already decided his future. She stood there for a long moment, watching his chest rise and fall, and noticed something that 10 doctors hadn't bothered to look for anymore. The movement was asymmetrical. His left side expanded fully with each breath, but his right side seemed restricted, as if something was compressing his lung capacity from inside. The way his neck veins were beginning to distend. The subtle signs of pressure building in a closed space. She'd seen this pattern before in Marjah, in the field hospital tent where a young Marine had taken shrapnel that punctured his pleural cavity, and without intervention, he would have coded within the hour. At 6:19 a.m., before she could report to human resources, a security guard found her at the nurse's station and handed her an envelope printed on official hospital letterhead. The state nursing board had initiated a formal investigation into her credentials, clinical judgment, and fitness for practice. Outside investigator assigned. All clinical activities suspended pending review. She had the right to legal representation. She should expect contact within 5 business days. Margaret opened the envelope, read each word, and folded the papers with the same careful precision she'd used to fold a flag. The guard who delivered it, Marcus, who'd worked security at Oak Creek for 8 years and had watched her arrive at 5:56 a.m. every shift without fail, looked genuinely sorry. "I don't like doing this," he said quietly. Dr. Hargrove's voice came from somewhere down the hallway, sharp and professional and deliberately loud enough to carry. "Nurse Walsh, I'm reassigning you effective immediately. Your services are no longer needed on pediatric ICU. Consider it administrative leave pending the board's investigation. You'll be working housekeeping in the West Wing, 3rd floor, until this matter is resolved. Return your badge and credentials to human resources." Margaret didn't argue. Argument would be insubordination. Argument would give him ammunition. She simply looked at Hargrove, really looked at him, and saw a man who had built a career on the assumption that no one would look too closely at the details. His suit probably cost more than her monthly mortgage. His watch was stainless steel and sapphire crystal, the kind that commanded presence just by existing on a wrist. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish. Everything about him broadcast the message that he had never needed to prove himself because his appearance had already done that work. He met her gaze and smiled, the kind of smile a man wears when he's just moved a chess piece his confident cannot be countered. "I trust you understand the seriousness of these allegations, Margaret. This will all be sorted, I'm sure. Though given the circumstances, I suspect it's best we minimize your patient contact." He was already turning away, already moving to the next task, already confident that a nurse with no credentials and no institutional protection could be handled like an inconvenient file. She walked to the administrative office, surrendered her badge, turned in her credentials, and left the building without a word. The morning air in the Raleigh parking lot was cool and carried the metallic smell of dawn, exhaust from the early traffic on Route 54, the green smell of rain coming in from the west, the particular scent of asphalt heating under weak sunshine. But she didn't drive away. Her hands turned the steering wheel toward the parking lot's far corner, the space that overlooked Jackson's window on the 4th floor, and she sat with the engine running. From this angle, through the condensation and morning glare, she could see the outline of his bed, the pale blue of the hospital gown, the ventilator tube taped at his mouth. 72 hours. That's what the specialists had said. 72 hours until they moved him to a facility designed for children whose bodies no longer worked, where the assumption would be that nothing could be done, where the decay would begin in earnest. Her phone buzzed. A text from her 17-year-old son Daniel. "Mom, where are you? You didn't come home." She stared at the message for a long time without responding. How could she explain that she'd walked away from the Navy because Marjah had broken something inside her that she couldn't fix, that when the nightmares came back and made her raise her voice at a recruit during weapons training, she'd chosen anonymity over honor, that she'd spent 20 years as just a nurse, just a quiet woman pushing a cart and taking orders, erasing the person she'd been because that person had seen too much. Daniel's father, her ex-husband David, had died in a motorcycle accident 6 years ago, still not knowing where she'd really served, what uniform she'd worn, why she sometimes woke up screaming about children in rubble and dust clouds that tasted like copper. She'd chosen that silence to protect him. To protect Daniel. To protect everyone from the thing inside her that had learned to move through dangerous places and make difficult choices. And now that same thing, that muscle memory, that instinct, that training, was screaming at her that Jackson Vance was dying in a hospital for stories above her head, and she was sitting in a car like a civilian, like someone powerless, like someone erased. That night, she didn't go home. She drove to Oakwood Cemetery instead, 40 minutes south of Raleigh, through darkness that seemed to accumulate with every mile. The rain started just as she turned onto the cemetery's narrow drive, the kind of heavy rain that sounds like static, like white noise, like the entire sky is just trying to wash everything away. David's headstone was in the southeast corner, marble white, engraved with dates and a verse about eternal rest that he'd chosen in a moment of strange sentimentality Margaret had never quite understood. She stood in front of it with rain soaking through her scrubs, her coat abandoned in the car, water running down her face and neck and dripping off the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one patch she'd kept after leaving the Navy, the only piece of her old identity she couldn't quite bring herself to destroy. "I walked away," she said aloud, her voice rough from disuse, from silence, from 20 years of not saying the things that mattered. "When Marjah broke me, I walked away. I chose to disappear into this place, this safe place, where no one needed to know what I'd been. Where nobody looked too closely. Where I could just be invisible and safe and nobody's weapon anymore." The rain hammered harder. The cemetery was empty except for the dead and the woman standing in their presence, speaking to the one grave marker that held the man who had loved her anyway, despite her silence, despite her distance, despite the fact that she'd never let him inside the fortress she'd built around herself. "That boy upstairs is dying. I know the signs. I've seen it before. 10 doctors decided he's gone, and they're moving on, and they're wrong, so completely, catastrophically wrong. And I'm here in the mud talking to you because I don't know how to be what he needs. I don't know how to be anything except invisible anymore." She collapsed to her knees then, rain streaming down, her hand sinking into mud that was cold and wet and real. The sound of her breathing came harsh and loud in the cemetery quiet, and for the first time in 20 years, the armor she'd built brick by brick, silence by silence, cracked down the center. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what was about to change everything. Margaret's badge swiped once before she let herself think about the consequences. 2:47 in the morning. The parking lot was empty except for her Civic gathering rain like a second-hand confession. She'd driven home, sat on the porch for 20 minutes without moving, then turned around and came back because the alternative was sleeping while Jackson died upstairs from something the 10 specialists couldn't see. The badge worked. It always worked until it didn't, and apparently the hospital's access system hadn't caught up to her termination yet, a window of maybe 6 hours before IT locked her out permanently. She moved through the service corridor instead of the main hallway, past the pharmacy with its glowing vials and the break room where no one would sit with her anymore. The PQ doors recognized her too. Muscle memory and institutional inertia carrying her forward like a current. Jackson's room was dark except for the monitor glow. His father was gone, back to whatever hotel the Navy had put him in, some Marriott near the interstate where SEAL commanders apparently slept while their sons lay paralyzed on memory foam. Margaret stepped to the bedside and her hands went still. She'd been a corpsman long enough to recognize what was happening in the space between one breath and the next one that never came. Oxygen saturation 84%. Now 79. His right chest wasn't moving. The left side was working alone, overdrive, pulling air that had nowhere to go except straight into the chest cavity where a pneumothorax was collapsing his lung like a fist closing. Neck veins bulging blue-black against his pale skin. Trachea shifted left. The 10 specialists had missed it because they were staring at the spine, at the spinal cord injury that had made them all give up, and nobody had bothered to listen to basic mechanics. Air pressure changes the shape of dying. Margaret didn't run. Running made noise. She moved to the crash cart instead, pulled open the medication drawer where everything was organized by people who'd never seen a child die from missed air, grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle and an alcohol swab. Her hands moved like they'd never stopped moving, like 20 years of civilian scrubs was something she'd borrowed from someone else's life. The antiseptic smell hit her sinuses sharp and clean as a memory. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Palpated. The needle went in smooth as a promise and broke something that had been holding the room hostage. The sharp hiss of released pressure filled the space like a confession being exhaled. Air screaming out of somewhere it shouldn't have been, and in that hiss was the sound of 10 doctors being wrong all at once. Jackson's oxygen saturation climbed. 81. 88. 94. His lips changed from blue to something close to pink, his chest finally moving on both sides like a bird remembering how to breathe. Margaret stepped back. She'd done what a corpsman does when the decision between regulation and conscience gets too small to measure. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm like a second heartbeat, and she could hear her own breathing underneath it, steady as a surgical laser, not trembling, never trembling. The door burst open at 3:14. Commander Vance in sweatpants and a government hoodie, his eyes moving from the monitor to Jackson's face to the needle still sitting on the bedside tray. "What did you?" "Tension pneumothorax." Margaret's voice came out like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't been sitting in a car crying at a grave just 18 hours ago. His right lung collapsed. The paralysis was masking the symptoms. "I performed emergency needle decompression. He needs a chest tube immediately and imaging, but the pressure's released." Vance stared at her. Something moved across his face that looked like recognition, but he was a SEAL commander standing next to his son who was suddenly breathing again, and everything else was just periphery. He moved to Jackson, his hand on the boy's shoulder, checking the oxygen saturation numbers like he could hold them in place through sheer force of will. "Thank you. Thank you, He stopped. His voice cracked. "Who are you?" But Margaret was already moving to the door, already knowing that the next part wasn't something a suspended nurse should be present for. Vance was reaching for the call button, his movements suddenly urgent and certain, and in 30 seconds the PQ would fill with people who would see the needle, see the monitor, see a procedure performed without authorization and build it into something that looked like assault instead of rescue. She was halfway down the hallway when she heard the code announced. Chest tube activation. Respiratory arriving. The machinery of a hospital that finally understood something was wrong. By morning, Dr. Hargrove had already rewritten the story. He stood in the conference room with 4 board members and a narrative that made Margaret's hand sound reckless, her decision sound dangerous, her decade of service sound like the work of someone unstable and unfit. "She performed an invasive procedure without authorization," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "On a pediatric patient. The chest tube came back clean, there was no pneumothorax. She endangered that child's life and compromised his treatment with a procedure that could have punctured his heart." The lie was so clean Margaret almost believed it herself when she heard it echoed back through the hallway. But she'd heard the air hiss out. She'd watched the oxygen numbers climb. She'd seen the blue change to pink. Security came at 2 o'clock. The same guard who'd smiled at her for 3 years, the one who always asked how her shift went, now holding a cardboard box like it was a bomb that had already exploded. His eyes wouldn't meet hers. "I'm sorry. I need to escort you out. Hospital policy during investigations." Margaret packed the box herself, though there was nothing much to pack. A sweater from her locker. Her personal stethoscope, the one with the worn earpieces that had listened to 1,000 heartbeats. A photo from the break room bulletin board of the pediatric team at last year's Christmas party, 3 years of her life smiling in scrubs next to people who'd suddenly become strangers. She walked through the PQ one last time, past the nurses' station where Beth and the others turned their faces away like she was carrying something contagious. past the bulletin board where her disciplinary notices were still posted, her name in bold print next to unauthorized procedure and patient endangerment in fonts designed to be read from across the room. The rain was coming down hard outside the windows, hammering the parking lot like applause for something nobody wanted to celebrate. Her Civic was where she'd left it. She sat in the driver's seat with the box on the passenger side and her hands on the steering wheel and didn't turn the ignition. Somewhere upstairs in a room she could still see from here, Jackson was recovering from a procedure that shouldn't have worked, that the hospital was now calling dangerous, that had saved his life while 10 doctors watched and did nothing. What happened next didn't just change Margaret Walsh's life, it broke open something that had been sealed shut for 20 years, something that was about to walk through those hospital doors and end careers in a way that no lawsuit or investigation ever could. Margaret sat in her car in the hospital parking lot the next morning, hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, unable to turn the ignition. Rain hammered the windshield like applause for a show she'd already lost. Somewhere above her, on the 4th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, Jackson Vance was recovering from a procedure that shouldn't have worked, a procedure 10 consulting doctors had declared unnecessary, a procedure that had saved his life while every specialist in that room watched and did nothing. She could see his window from here, the corner room on pediatric ICU, the one with the view of the parking lot. The one where she'd held a dying child's hand while a man in a pressed suit lied about her competence. The rain kept falling. Margaret's eyes stayed dry. That was the thing about 20 years of burial, even grief had to wait its turn behind the discipline. The cardboard box sat on the passenger seat beside her, the one security had handed her yesterday. Her scrubs. Her badge. Her stethoscope with the initials M. Walsh engraved along the tubing. Everything a nurse becomes, stripped down to objects. She'd driven to Oakwood Cemetery after they'd escorted her out, stood at David's grave in mud that came up to her ankles, water streaming down her face while rain fell harder. "I saved that boy twice," she'd whispered to the stone. "And they're giving up on him. I failed you. I failed them. I failed everyone." The words had come out like a weapon turned inward, each one a laceration. 20 years she'd held it together. 20 years of being just another nurse, just someone doing the work, just a woman with graying hair who nobody asked about the patch sewn inside her jacket lining. And now Jackson was going to die because 10 doctors had decided that hope was unprofessional. She couldn't leave. That was the thing that kept her pinned to the driver's seat, unable to turn the key. If she drove away, she accepted it. If she drove away, Jackson became another file, another case, another child who should have survived but didn't because the system had collectively shrugged. Margaret had spent 2 decades running from the moment she'd failed to save civilians in Marjah, 37 people buried under a school collapse, and she'd only gotten out 7. 7. The number had hollowed her out, made her small, made her safe in scrubs and anonymity. But Jackson wasn't buried under rubble. Jackson was 4 floors above her, recovering from a procedure she'd performed at 2 a.m. when every rational part of her brain said to walk away, let the system work, let the doctors decide. Her hands had moved anyway. Muscle memory took over. The same hands that had performed needle decompression on wounded civilians in a war zone, the same hands that had pulled Jackson's infant body from dust 20 years ago, had saved him again in darkness while everyone slept. The knock on her car window came so suddenly that Margaret's instinct almost took over. She went halfway to the door lock before she saw the face pressed against the Rain Street glass. Daniel. Her 17-year-old son, soaked through, hair plastered to his skull, holding something wrapped in his jacket against his chest. She opened the door. He didn't wait for words. He ran the 2 steps around the hood and pushed a wooden shadow box against the window frame, and Margaret saw what was inside and stopped breathing. The medals gleamed against navy blue felt. Bronze Star. Navy Commendation Medal. Purple Heart. A second Purple Heart. Decoration she'd hidden in the attic of their house in a box marked winter clothes, decoration she'd never shown him, never explained, never let him touch. "Mom," Daniel said, water dripping from his chin. "They need to see these." She wanted to say no. The word was there, a habit worn smooth by 2 decades. But the boy was already running toward the hospital entrance, the shadow box held like an offering, and Margaret's door was open and her feet were on the wet asphalt and she was moving without deciding to move. The elevator climbed. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Her security badge was gone, but Daniel had mentioned his mother to a nurse in passing. She's the one who saved Jackson last night, and the staff knew. Somewhere in the hospital infrastructure, there was already a story being told, a whispered narrative of the nurse who'd been fired for being right. The PQ doors opened to Commander Eric Vance sitting in a plastic chair beside his son's bed, his navy cover on his lap, his jaw tight as a clenched fist. He looked up. Daniel stepped forward, the shadow box extended, and said the words that broke everything open. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Navy Special Warfare." The world didn't stop. The monitors kept beeping. The ventilator kept breathing for Jackson. But something in the air pressure changed, the way it changes when a helicopter is about to land, that shift in density that makes your bones feel heavier. Commander Vance stood slowly. He didn't ask questions. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, past the scrubs and the exhaustion, past 20 years of invisibility, and he picked up the shadow box from Daniel's hands. His fingers traced each medal like he was reading Braille, like the decorations told him a story written in a language he'd learned in blood and sand. "Bronze Star," he said quietly. His voice cracked. "Navy Commendation Medal." His eyes closed. "Purple Heart." When he opened them again and saw the second one, something broke in his face. 2 Purple Hearts. "You were at Marjah." "The school." He looked at his son. Understanding moved through him like a shockwave. "You pulled civilians from that collapse. You saved the school children. That was you." He lifted his eyes to Margaret's and held them there. "You saved my son's life in a war zone 20 years ago. And you just saved his life again. Last night. In the dark. While the 10 men who went to medical school said it couldn't be done." Margaret's hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, came out measured and clear. "He moved his toes." "I know he did." The commander's voice was solid now, military again, a voice that had given orders in firefights. "I know because you knew what the 10 doctors missed. You knew because you've seen this before. You knew because you were trained to save lives when everyone else is trained to follow protocol." The doors to the PQ burst open, and 2 people in dark suits entered with the bearing of people accustomed to moving through any space they chose. FBI badges. The woman leading them was holding a folder thick enough to be a novel. "Dr. Bernard Hargrove," she asked, though Hargrove wasn't there. Nobody seemed to know where he was yet. "We need to speak with hospital administration. We've been investigating fraudulent billing practices and insurance kickbacks for 6 months. This nurse's charting records have just provided us with the documentation we needed to move forward with criminal charges." The folder opened. Patient charts. Dates. Procedures billed that never happened. Supply company invoices marked with Hargrove's initials. The conspiracy laid out in Margaret's meticulous handwriting, the same handwriting that had been called obsessive and paranoid just days ago. By afternoon, Dr. Hargrove's office had been emptied by the same security guard who'd escorted Margaret out the day before. The guard carried a cardboard box to Hargrove's desk, placed it on the blotter with the precision of someone performing a ritual. When Hargrove arrived to find his security badge deactivated, his hospital privileges revoked, his medical license suspended pending criminal investigation, the guard was still standing there. "Doctor," the man said, his voice like gravel in a mixer. "I believe you know the way out." Hargrove didn't argue. His face had gone ash-white, the color of someone watching an entire life collapse in real time. He carried the box. He walked. Within the hour, the board members who'd golfed with him for years were issuing statements about concerns we'd been meaning to report. The state investigator he'd brought in to destroy Margaret now turned her attention to his fabricated complaints. His network, the relationships he'd leveraged, the favors he'd called in, the careful construction of alliances built on golf courses and dinner parties, scattered like ash in wind. Margaret watched from the observation window of the PQ as Jackson's fingers twitched. Just barely. Just a whisper of motion. The first sign that the pressure on his spine was relieving, that the procedure had worked, that the child who'd been declared permanently paralyzed by consensus was going to walk again. Her personnel file was amended by end of business. All disciplinary actions removed. Formal apology issued. She was offered her position back with back pay and promotion to nurse manager. Commander Vance made a personal call to Navy Medical Command, and within days, Margaret received communication about returning to service with advanced rank if she chose. But Margaret stood at Jackson's bedside that night, watching the child she'd pulled from rubble 20 years ago, watching him twitch and shift and show signs of neural recovery that 10 doctors had said was impossible, and she realized something that hit her like shrapnel in slow motion. She'd been running from Marjah instead of healing from it. The nightmares that had made her raise her voice at a recruit, the PTSD that had driven her to bury her own identity, to disappear into anonymity, to pretend she was just another nurse, she'd tried to bury it all, but it had only festered under the surface, rotting from the inside. She'd saved Jackson twice, but she'd never saved herself once. Not yet. Daniel stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway lights. "You coming home?" he asked. Margaret reached into her jacket and pulled out the faded unit patch. For 20 years it had been sewn inside the lining, hidden against the fabric of her heart. She looked at it in Navy Special Warfare, worn thread, the edges soft from time. Then she pinned it to the outside of her scrubs where everyone could see it. Where she could see it. "Yeah," she said. "I think I finally am." 6 months later, Jackson took his first steps in the rehabilitation gym, Commander Vance on one side, Margaret on the other. The 10 doctors who'd declared him permanently paralyzed watched from the observation window. 8 had issued formal apologies, acknowledging they'd missed the tension pneumothorax because they'd anchored on the spinal injury and never looked deeper. 2 refused and were now under peer review. Margaret had been promoted to Director of Pediatric Critical Care at Oak Creek Memorial, and she'd implemented new protocols that required comprehensive trauma assessment on every pediatric patient, protocols that prevented doctors from settling for consensus when the evidence didn't add up. She'd also started attending VA support groups for PTSD, finally addressing Marjah instead of hiding from it, finally letting herself heal the parts of her that had been buried in dust for 20 years. Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table in a strip mall across town, selling discount insurance policies to anyone who would listen. His medical license was permanently revoked. His fraud trial was pending. A former colleague walked past the window where he sat without acknowledging him. Margaret stood at David's grave again, but this time in sunshine, Daniel beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "I thought I failed everyone by walking away," she said quietly. "But maybe I had to break before I could be whole enough to save Jackson twice." Daniel squeezed her shoulders. "You never failed anyone, Mom." At the hospital, Margaret's faded unit patch was framed in the PQ break room alongside a plaque that read, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." Margaret walked past it every single day, no longer hiding, no longer running, finally both the nurse and the warrior she'd always been. The patch had been sewn inside for 20 years. Now it caught the light. Now everyone could see exactly who she was. If this story moved you, if you believe that heroes walk among us in scrubs and that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Leave a comment below telling us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And if you want to honor military medical heroes and support veteran healthcare workers, visit the links in the description to learn how you can make a difference. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply see people. Really see them. Thank you for watching.